Hey, thanks for being a part of the conversation. Let's do some pod crashing. Episode number 264 is with Trevor Aaronson from the podcast Alphabet Boys. Are you really making soup, Trevor?
No.
Oh, because I'm the soup king, man. That's what I picked up during the lockdown. I discovered that kitchen, and I love to make soup.
That's a good talent to have.
I want to have a food truck, but I want to have different soups every day. And people go, "You're a failure, then, dude. People don't want to have new every day." Well, what the heck were you eating when you came up with this idea for Alphabet Boys? Because this to me is taking journalism to a completely different level.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do with Alphabet Boys is really marry, the classics, the classic investigative reporting with narrative storytelling. So we tell the story of a single case over one season. So over 10 episodes, we tell the story of a single FBI, DEA, or ATF case. And what we're really focusing on are our access to undercover recordings. We have the FBI or DEA recordings that we then use to tell the story, and we try to cast a critical eye on a number of these cases to really raise this question of whether these federal agencies using undercover sting operations are stopping criminals and stopping crime, or whether they are essentially creating criminals and creating crime.
Well, see, I've always believed that part right there, and everybody goes, no, that's just a conspiracy. I'm going, no, they want the attention. They want something. And I've always looked at it as being, let's create a criminal so that we can get more money coming our way, because we're gonna be the super dogs here and make this thing work.
That's exactly it. What ends up happening is, federal law enforcement is really measured by the metrics of traditional local law enforcement, right? Like, you're funded based on how many arrests you make, how many prosecutions you have. And so there's a direct incentive for the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies to use these types of undercover stings that essentially entrap people, but then they can, announce to the public and announce to Congress this big bust that was made. And we saw that a lot during the post 9/11 era, where the FBI infiltrated Muslim communities using informants and then put together terrorism plots that likely wouldn't have existed were it not for the FBI providing the means, the opportunity, and even the weapons, the fake weapons that were used as part of the plot. And what we see now is this type of tactic being used by a lot of these agencies to essentially manufacture crimes. And so the first season that we focus on in Alphabet Boys is about this FBI informant who is a violent felon who'd been convicted of sexual assault and menacing with a weapon. He gets recruited by the FBI, paid thousands of dollars every few weeks to infiltrate the racial justice movement in Denver during the summer of 2020. He's this cartoonish man who dresses in military-style fatigues and drives a hearse, and basically was going up to the protests, trying to entice activists into committing crimes, into moving forward in violent plots. At the same time, he was accusing the leaders of these protest movements of being informants, creating kind of the shades of 60s style COINTELPRO from the FBI, where a similar abuse happened when the FBI was investigating the Black Panthers and other groups. What we saw in this case in summer of 2020 that we focus on in the first season is that the FBI was basically trying to turn otherwise peaceful protesters into potentially violent criminals through the use of this very aggressive undercover tactic.
I'm glad you brought it up that way, because I remember reading a story from the Dalai Lama when he visited the United States during the Vietnam protests. He was so shocked by our actions and reactions here in the States, because in his heart, protest means peace. What? I thought you guys were fighting for peace.
Yeah, there's a long history in this country, obviously, of the federal government being quite concerned about mass demonstrations and movements. We saw that during the civil rights era and the FBI's reaction to it. And then we had the Church Committee, and the Church Committee exposed all of these abuses. And this was supposed to be a dark chapter in American history that doesn't happen any longer. And I think what we've seen happen over the last 20 years is that a lot of the powers that had been dialed back as a result of the Church Committee were then given back to the FBI and other law enforcement agencies in the post 9/11 era in the pursuit of possible terrorists. And now, 20 years after 9/11, all of those powers still exist within the federal agencies, and they are using them in ways that were not intended. And we're using them in ways that are kind of more similar to how we saw them used during the 1960s.
So are you locating some very secretive rules in the way that I know that here in North Carolina, if I were to go into a conversation and I knowingly know that I'm recording that conversation, that's legal. But I mean, is that what you mean by the secret tapes and things like that? Is that as long as one person knows that it's being recorded, we can move ahead and save everything that we come in contact with?
So those types of recording laws vary by state. You know, some states it's just one party, in other states it's two party. But in this particular case, the FBI as a law enforcement agency is recording these conversations no matter the state. It happens, they're doing it under the guise of law enforcement investigation. And so the recordings that we use in Alphabet Boys are the ones that are created by the undercover agent or the informant. So they're basically wearing a wire and they're going in and in talking to people. And these recordings are then used as evidence later or put into an FBI file. And so our goal is to try to reveal what's happening in these cases through the use of these undercover recordings. And so the way we tell Alphabet Boys is to tell it as a narrative, to tell it as a single story. It's told over 10 episodes. But a big part of that is allowing listeners to kind of be in the room as this investigation is happening and hear the undercover recordings and the people talking. And so that's really kind of the key to our storytelling technique, is to not only show what was happening, but then to allow listeners to be able to listen directly to these recordings and make a judgment for themselves as to whether they think, you know, what's happening is legitimate and necessary, or whether it's an abuse of power by an agency like the FBI.
Well, listeners need to understand that this is what I call a best friend podcast, in the way that you get in the car when you're driving to work and you turn this on and you'll be at work in the blink of an eye. And that's the thing about it, is that you take us to a place where we're so drawn into the story that it's like, oh my God, I feel like I'm one of the members here.
That's what we're trying to do. You know, I think some of the best journalism that can be done is where you reveal something, but you do it in a way that's told in a story and told in a way that you feel entertained, right? I mean, humans are this way, right? That we're all driven by stories. And so that's really what we're trying to do in Alphabet Boys, is reveal what we think are critically important accountability issues with federal law enforcement, but do it in a way that you can listen to the show and find it enjoyable. And there's a certain voyeuristic aspect to it, that you feel like you're listening to these secret recordings, because essentially you are. In this case, we're revealing these recordings for the first time. These were recordings that were made by federal law enforcement agents that they didn't anticipate would be on the radio or on a podcast. And so we're trying to bring people into this world that seems very secretive, and for many reasons is.
Well, we're supposed to be afraid of them. If we see someone with FBI on their shirt, or DEA or ATF, we're supposed to be going, oh my God, back it down, back it down. But things have changed since the lockdown and since the things that have happened around the country in the past 2 to 3 years.
I've been covering the FBI now for a little over 15 years. And, you know, for a long period of that time, there had been an unwillingness to criticize these federal agencies. You know, the FBI has done a very good job throughout its history of crafting this image through media and movies of being this faultless agency, this perfect agency. And I think that's really persisted in American culture. But in recent years, I think there has become a higher degree of cynicism, a higher degree of skepticism regarding federal law enforcement. And I think that's a good thing. You know, I think obviously there's a purpose for federal law enforcement. I'm not, you know, saying we should abolish the police or abolish federal law enforcement. But I think what we need is to recognize is that these are agencies with hugely powerful powers, and that these powers need to be kept in check through a greater level of accountability in Congress and elsewhere than we see. And so we also see Alphabet Boys as very much a way of kind of keeping these agencies more accountable by revealing exactly what they're doing in these cases.
Why Denver and not Portland or Seattle? You know, because of Antifa and people like that.
So our theory, and I think it's a reasonable one to have, is that this happened in cities across the country in the summer of 2020. Yeah. Denver is just the one that we have the first behind the scenes look at through the use of these recordings. And so our hope is that by revealing what happened in Denver, you know, we may get more information about how these tactics were used in other cities.
Dude, it happened in Charlotte. I mean, and it went on for several nights, and you know, we weren't used to this kind of stuff, and then you go down there in the aftermath of it. I think that was more haunting than physically reading about it as it was happening in real time.
You know, what we saw in Denver was that the FBI informant had become a leader of the movement and was actually encouraging a lot of these protests that became violent. Oh, and, you know, we saw that kind of violence in cities across the country, as you said, in Charlotte as well. And I think the question that we raise in Alphabet Boys with the Denver case is, to what degree did government infiltrators play a role in encouraging the violence? I mean, obviously, a good degree of the violence was spontaneous. You can't blame all of this on government infiltrators. Right. But, you know, just a couple of informants in a group can really change the tenor of what's happening. And I think the question is, like, in what other cities did what happened in Denver occur where an informant was encouraging the type of violence and destruction that we saw that summer, and the insidious tactics that the FBI was using as part of that?
Yeah, there's many times in the first two podcasts that I sat there and I thought of my own city while it was playing out. I kept going, oh, is this what was taking place? Oh my God, what happens if it was? What should I be taking notes here? What am I going to watch for the next time?
Yeah, I think that's always something to be aware of in any of these situations, right? We've seen the FBI and other law enforcement agents take on roles that are outside what you think of as the traditional bounds of law enforcement. In the post 9/11 era, the FBI became as much of an intelligence agency as it did a law enforcement agency. And what we're seeing in Denver is that the FBI informant was not only doing all of the things we've talked about, but he was also providing information back to the FBI about protesters, their names, their brief biographies, who they were associating with, even though these protesters did not commit crimes, had not been accused of crimes, and they're basically just building intelligence files on Americans who are exercising their First Amendment rights. And I think that should be seen as troubling to Americans as well, that, there is a question about how the FBI is collecting information about Americans who are not suspected of crimes. Again, another example of how post 9/11 powers intended to stop terrorists, have remained in the FBI's, arsenal, and are now being used in ways that were not necessarily intended.
You put some depth into the storyline when Michael and Adam returned to Denver after fighting ISIS. I mean, this right here is it's like trying to get into the mind of someone who saw destruction before they even entered destruction in their own country.
So it's a lot of the informants that are recruited by the FBI are not good people, right? They're not choir boys. And what the FBI will say is if you want to catch the devil, you have to go to hell, right? And what they mean is you can't use, this button down guy as your informant. If you're going to, have an informant infiltrate criminal groups, he needs to be a criminal himself. He's got to do criminal things. And so what we see often is that these informants that are recruited by the FBI have very, very checkered pasts, and have pasts that suggest maybe they aren't the most credible. And then at the same time, they're being incentivized to find criminals because the FBI is paying them thousands of dollars, and if they don't find criminals, then they're not going to make money. And so, in the case in Denver, this guy Mickey Windecker, had this background where he'd been a volunteer fighter for the Peshmerga. There were certainly questions about his previous work as a police cooperator, but because of his felony record, is in a position where his employment prospects aren't the best. And here's the FBI basically saying, "Hey, if you help us entrap these protesters, we'll pay you a lot of money." And so that creates a perverse incentive for someone like that to create crimes. And that's what we see in a lot of these cases, that the informant will push people along, even drag them across the line, because they know that if they do that, they have a lot of money to make. And so the incentives in place aren't necessarily justice, right? The incentive isn't justice. The incentive is this informant wants to be paid, so he's going to do things to move this case along. At the same time, the FBI agent knows if he builds a case, it means promotions, it means raises. And so there are a number of really perverse incentives that are built into the system that create situations where the FBI is really essentially entrapping people in order to build cases.
Let's dig a little bit deeper here in the way that, because I'm one of those people I'm a sideline quarterback kind of guy. But here's the thing. I've always believed that the informants or somebody goes in and they convince the local politicians, you got to come down. They just be down here, be seen. And that also adds to the fire.
For sure. What we see is informants acting in all sorts of ways, right? They will, what we saw in Denver was that the informant, Mickey Windecker, was specifically encouraging people to come out to events that he had a good reason to believe would turn violent, and was encouraging violence, right? So, there is a question, traditionally the use of informants would be that you would have a criminal organization and that you use an informant to find out what's going on, kind of like a Johnny Brasco style mafia investigation. And there's a place for that, right? But the problem becomes when the FBI informant becomes an integral part of whatever criminal conspiracy is going on, is necessary to the criminal conspiracy happening. And so what we're seeing in a lot of these cases is that the FBI informant or undercover agent is so critical to the plot that the plot wouldn't happen were it not for the FBI informant or undercover agent. And so that raises questions of whether the FBI is essentially creating this crime instead of stopping it.
All right, from one podcaster to another here, because you know that we both have a sense of freedom now that we've longed for our entire careers. Could you ever step back into a terrestrialized kind of journalism, radio or television world, and be trapped in that cubicle doing little stories?
No, so I mean, I've been really fortunate in the sense that I've been able to work on these long-term projects like this, and I think they're incredibly important to do. And one of the things that's happened is there's been a huge upheaval in journalism. Some of that has been bad, but I think some of that has been good. We have new ways of telling stories, podcast series being one of them. And I think, the more we can use these ways to get independent journalism out, the better. And I think, this kind of project is, I think incredibly important. But I also think it's an example of how journalism and the market for journalism are changing, that we're seeing, classical investigative reporting being done in a podcast series, whereas more traditionally that would have been done in a newspaper or a magazine.
Right. So in future episodes, maybe season 2 or season 3, will the Alphabet Boys include the IRS?
It could. We only have we've got seasons 1 and 2 in the works. Good now. Season 1 is out now, and season 2 is about a DEA case. But in the future, obviously the Alphabet or the IRS is one of the Alphabet agencies, so it would be fun to visit a case that they've worked on. What
have you learned? Seriously, I mean, you don't dive into a project like this and not come out a different person on the other side.
Yeah, I have to admit, one of the things I've learned is just that there is a cynical aspect to a lot of these federal investigations that, I think a lot of federal agents go in meaning well, right? I don't think anyone goes to the FBI and says, I want to entrap people in sting operations. But I think one of the things I've learned is that there's a certain bureaucratic evil that exists, that once these agents get into the agency, they realize that there are these perverse incentives that I've described, and that they end up finding themselves in situations where if they want to move up, they have to get involved in these cases that are quite questionable. And I think what we're seeing is that, because there isn't enough exposure of what's happening, and this is a big part of why we're doing Alphabet Boys, is that you really can't have accountability and change and reform unless you understand what the problems are. And we're not seeing enough oversight of these agencies by the news media in general and by Congress in particular. And so with this, what we're trying to do is reveal to Americans how these cases operate, not only to tell a good story, because we think these are great stories, but also just to reveal some of the problems that these agencies have.
Dude, I'm just so proud of you for doing this. I mean, because it's a really good podcast. And it's just one of those things where I have to sit there many times when I'm driving and I go, could this work on a flat screen TV? Or is it that you guys have mastered the art of theater of the mind?
Yeah, theater of the mind is a big part of this, right? I mean, I think there's a certain intimacy in a podcast that you put on your headphones and you have someone like me telling you the story, but then we're also playing you these undercover recordings, and you can, bring your mind as if you're sitting at that table as this is happening. And so, I think there's a certain benefit to telling these stories in audio format that may not exist if we were doing this as a docuseries on Netflix, for example. Yep.
You got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you, Trevor.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay?
You too. Thanks. Bye.